This is, yeah, the LeBron James of regulators. Okay. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, what's going on? Lina, before we get started, I believe that you guys wanted someone else to be on the call as well. Do you want to tell me who? I mean, do you want to write in the chat who that person is, or if not, we can just have this conversation one on one if necessary. I mean, if you don't mind.
I think we were gonna have it one-on-one. Let me just check. Okay, it seems like our staff is watching the stream, so we should be good.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. Okay. Wow, what an honor! What an honor to have you here today. Let me just put you on screen as well so we can. All right, there it is. Ladies and gentlemen, the regulator, the trust buster herself, FTC Commissioner Lina Khan is in the building. This is spectacular. Thank you so much for coming on. And it is a joy to have you here. It is actually a momentous time to have you here as well, as breaking news just came out approximately half an hour ago that a judge has blocked Kroger's $24.6 billion merger with Albertsons, where the judge sided with the FTC, finding that the deal would reduce competition for U.S. grocery shoppers. Not sure if you want to speak on that at all. I don't know. I mean, it is breaking, but thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here with you. And yeah, I was just literally before I jumped on this reading the opinion that we just got from this judge in Oregon. This was the largest proposed supermarket merger in U.S. history. It's still in litigation, so limited what I can say, but this is a big win for the FTC.
Hell yeah! So you are, I think, one of the unsung heroes who is criminally underrated in the Biden administration and did not, in my opinion, get the worthy praise that you and your team deserved. Having said that, I wanted to talk to you about a lot of the. I wanted to talk to you about a lot of the issues that you've tackled. But before we get to that, if you don't mind, is it possible for you to describe maybe what you do and what the concept of trusts are or monopolies are and how they come about in America?
Yeah, happy to. So I serve as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. This is a federal agency that was created 110 years ago. We actually just celebrated our 110th birthday. And the agency was created basically against the backdrop of the robber barons, right? The industrial trusts. So think like the meat trust, the steel trust, the oil trust. And basically what had happened was we'd had the Industrial Revolution, all of these great technological advances, these new technologies, but simultaneously a lot of concentration of power in the hands of a relatively few number of individuals and firms. At that time, the way that these monopolies were organized as businesses were kind of trusts, hence antitrust, hence trust busting. But the basic idea was really one that goes back to all the way to the founding, which was if what we care about is Americans being free and having real liberty and not having to worry about the arbitrary exercise of power, you need to have safeguards against the state. And our Constitution does that in terms of checks and balances. But you also need to have safeguards against tyrants of trade, as they were called, as of private monopolies, because you need to safeguard against concentration of private power as well. Because, the way people experience freedom in their day-to-day lives is less through interacting on an ongoing daily basis with their government representative, but is through all of these commercial interactions and transactions and economic relationships. And so if you allow bullying and coercion to be okay in our economic realm, that's really going to undermine people's experience of freedom and liberty, right? And so the principles of antitrust and anti-monopoly are actually foundational to our country as a democracy. So that's kind of the original vision. Our agency is small. We're like 1,300 people, but we have oversight across the entire economy. We have a fantastic team. Under this administration, we've really been trying to reinvigorate how the agency enforces the law, uses its tools, and really turn the page on a approach since the Reagan years that had assumed that kind of big is always better and that somehow monopolies are going to deliver lower prices and be better for us. And I think we're just living with reams of reality that contradict that. And so we need to update how we enforce the law too.
Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like this is directly against the normal understanding of trust, both universally in other OECD nations, but also specifically in America, throughout American history. The notion that I think the American conceptualization of monopolies and whether they are worthy of scrutiny or whether they're worthy of being busted, right, is entirely dependent on the consumer impact, right? I feel like this is different than just fundamentally how monopolies or oligopolies occur. That as long as the prices are low, as long as the prices are kept low, or at least if they like consistently increase, but only marginally year over year, that these monopolies should not be touched and are not worthy of any scrutiny whatsoever. Would you say that that is different than the attitude demonstrated by other countries?
I mean, the United States is kind of a leader in antitrust and anti-monopoly, and a lot of other countries have kind of adopted their laws, in more recent decades. And the U.S. has actually had an important role in influencing how other countries have done things. And it was really interesting when I came into this role and started interacting more with international enforcers. They were kind of taken aback because for decades now, US enforcers had kind of been chiding other countries and saying, hey, you got to be nicer to your monopolies. And, under this administration, we were like, no, we're going to enforce the law. We need to, be really assertive. We need to protect the public from this type of law breaking. And you're right that there are different ways that monopolies can illegally abuse their power, right? They can hike prices, they can depress wages, they can squash out entrepreneurs and new businesses. And I think what's been really perverse is that even if you say, okay, what the philosophy of the last 40 years was we're only going to address law violations by monopolies that they're raising prices, is that we've actually seen higher prices in a whole set of areas. And so that approach on its own terms seems to have failed in ways that created kind of the opening to come in and say, hey, we're going to, take a fresh look and reinvigorate things.
Yeah. Yeah, because the obvious elimination of competition is if you want to be the domineering force in a market, then inevitably when there's no more competition remaining, you get to set the prices, and you can slowly but surely, depending on how much you want to improve your profit margins, increase the prices, or at the very least, tackle certain other aspects of the productive forces, i.e., labor, and consistently make labor conditions worse and worse, or never really keep up with never increase wages in a meaningful way. And I think it harms both workers, but it also ultimately inevitably harms the consumers as well. So obviously, I am on a platform that's owned by Amazon, but I have to ask you, as someone who has been very critical of Jeff Bezos' practices and Amazon in general, so you wrote a formative work at, I believe, Yale Law School that specifically tackled Amazon as a monopoly. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what what that journey was that got you to become the commissioner of the FTC at such a young age.
Yeah, so I had a bit of a funny backdoor way into all of this work, which was I actually originally wanted to be a journalist and a reporter. I graduated during the financial crisis, where
Terrible profession.
jobs generally were hard.
You're doing
Yeah,
so much more important work, I think.
but ended up kind of landing with a think tank that had a little bit more of a journalism bent to it. But my job was really to do research to understand had different industries and markets evolved over decades. And so my job was to document market structure, which can sound kind of technical. But basically, I was kind of doing deep dives into areas like agriculture, like book publishing, like airlines, like rental cars, like all sorts of commodity markets. And across the board, and somewhat of an underappreciated trend in our economy, has been one of systemic consolidation. So, where decades ago in a particular market, you had dozens and dozens of competitors, today, in part through mergers and acquisitions, you've gone from dozens to just a handful. And sometimes this degree of consolidation can kind of be masked from people because you can go to the grocery store and see dozens of brands, be it in laundry detergent or diapers or what have you. But actually, those dozens of brands are still only controlled by a handful of companies, right?
Yeah.
And so there can be this illusion of choice, and that consolidation and centralization of power was something that was really fascinating to me, especially since we had these laws on the books that were supposed to be anti-monopoly, but it seemed that some of these laws were instead now facilitating that very consolidation, monopolization. So I just became really fascinated in like, how did this happen? A lot of my job at that point also had involved just talking to regular people. So I spent a lot of time understanding how the chicken farming industry worked, where you basically have, millions of consumers on one side, thousands of farmers on the other, and they're actually just connected by a handful of these giant chicken processors. And so what that means practically is that if you're a chicken farmer in America, your entire livelihood can be dependent on the whims of a single company. And talking to these chicken farmers, you sensed a real sense of fear, honestly, about not wanting to get on the wrong side of this firm, about waking up one day and getting handed the sickly chicks instead of the healthy ones. And it was just an exercise of arbitrary power that our nation and our values are supposed to be against. And so fast forward, I decided to go to law school, ended up writing this paper that was in part informed by the conversations I had with investors and the small businesses that were selling on Amazon. And ended up writing a piece around how the governing framework of antitrust, I thought at that time, was not adequate for capturing the reality of how digital platforms in particular could amass and exercise monopoly power.
Yeah. One of the predatory practices of Amazon that's like pretty obvious for people is routinely trying to purchase using the algorithm that they have inside of their sales structure to figure out like what products are actually working really well, and then as far as I understand, either trying to buy out these companies in its entirety, or if they don't play ball, if they want to retain ownership over their product, like creating an alternative product. Pushing I believe it was a diaper, right? Like there's a diaper company, there's like a story around a diaper company that's like very famous, creating a Amazon basic version of that same product, pushing down within its own search function the competitive product, and also underpricing like the new competitive product that they've made in an effort to basically destroy this smaller producer, with the hopes of either, down the line purchasing them for pennies on the dollar, or just completely crippling them and bankrupting them. This practice of undercutting, I think, is commonplace in virtually every aspect of American industry, from Walmart coming into underserved neighborhoods and closing up shops, the mom and pop shops in general, and then when there's no more profit to be to be squeezed out in these underserved neighborhoods, like just closing up shop and leaving entirely, leaving places like West Virginia, for example, without any sort of grocery chain that they can rely on. And it's a pretty damaging practice, but it's oftentimes sheltered it's oftentimes not immediately addressed. And I wanted to, I guess I wanted to talk briefly about the communication strategies, because something that I've always been fascinated by is the ways, the invisible ways in which the government works that we kind of take for granted, from the FDA, all the regulatory agencies like the FDA down to the FTC, SEC, and or even like the National Weather Service, for example. Like we don't really factor in the ways in which like our lives are made better and improved by people like yourself. So how do we address that? What are some of the biggest W's, for example, that you have had with the FTC under your reign, under the Lina Khan regime, that you don't think has gotten like proper consideration?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been a thrilling, 3.5 years, and I've been really fortunate to have a fantastic team at the agency. And honestly, we have delivered W after W for the American people.
Yeah.
We took on patenting abuse, where we found that inhalers have been around for decades, but Americans are still paying hundreds of dollars for them, and generics have not been able to come into the market as much. Our team took a close look and figured out that part of why that was is that some of these inhaler manufacturers are listing patents for things like the little piece of plastic on your inhaler.
Yeah.
And so we called that out. And then 3 of the 4 big inhaler manufacturers said they're going to drop how much Americans pay down from hundreds of dollars to just $35. We've taken on non-compete clauses. These are the contractual provisions in people's employment contracts that say, even after you leave your current employer, you can't go work for certain competitors. You can't go start your own competing business. These non-competes started off in the boardroom, but they now, are in employment contracts for janitors, security guards, fast food workers, people making minimum wage, doctors across the country, healthcare professionals across the country. And so we've taken on these coercive contracts. We passed a rule that would eliminate them. We've taken law enforcement action, resulting in thousands of non-competes being dropped. We're also just taking on some of the daily indignities that people experience. It can feel like just being a consumer in America today just does involve all of these small obstacles and barriers that really grate on you. Just to give you a few examples, we finalized a rule that would require companies make it as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to sign up for one, because we've seen that as more and more companies are switching to service-based revenue and subscriptions, they have an incentive to make it super easy to sign up and then absurdly difficult to cancel. And we've brought lawsuits, including against Amazon, against Adobe, against a whole set of companies that deliberately thwarted people being able to cancel. And this means that these companies are taking tens, if not hundreds of dollars from people a month for subscriptions that they no longer want, right? And nobody should be stuck paying for a service that they want to exit. We've also been putting money back in people's pockets. Actually, just yesterday, we announced that we're starting to send back checks to people that were tricked by Epic Games. We brought a lawsuit against Epic, finding that they had basically, led people to make purchases they didn't intend. Kids were racking up, hundreds of thousands of dollars in charges. So we brought a lawsuit there. We're sending back, we just sent back $72 million is the first tranche of money back. We've been going after data brokers, which surveil Americans and collect all sorts of sensitive data, like your medical history, your precise geolocation, your browsing history, making sure that there are some kind of rules of the road there and how this sensitive data gets used, and making sure it's not exploited. So, we've done that. We've taken action across healthcare markets, across grocery markets, wanting to make sure that our markets are fair and open and competitive.
I mean, yeah, that's that's a W after W. So do you feel like there is a way to properly communicate these things to the broader public? Like, if we're going to be super serious, I know you're a government official, so I don't know, how much, like, what you can say in an official position, in an official capacity, but like, do you feel like the coverage on this has been sufficient? Because I was rather shocked to see you on 60 Minutes. If I'm being honest, like you rarely ever see invisible government employees be prominently displayed like this. But do you feel like this is a good thing? Do you feel like it was enough? Should there be more of it? These are the questions I have for you.
Yeah, look, I made it a priority to really engage broadly with kind of media across the entire landscape. I also made it a big priority to go out and learn from people across the country. And one thing that's interesting about the type of job that I have is that it's very easy to become very insulated, where the kind of people that you're interacting with, the kind of information that you're getting on a day-to-day basis is coming from a relatively small number of sources, and it can lead to blind spots. And so a big priority for me has been actually opening the doors of the agency and just making it easier for people to give their views on what's happening out there, to share problems that they're seeing. So we started doing these regular open commission meetings where anybody in America can come and talk to me and my four colleagues as commissioners, tell us what they're seeing. We have, franchisees come, people who drive for ride sharing companies. We've heard from people who have lost family members who were rationing insulin because it's so expensive. We've heard from people who have kids are suffering from abuse on social media. I mean, just like the full landscape. And we've also done listening sessions across the country. So we've gone to places like Baraboo, Wisconsin. And, we went to Colorado to listen to farmers. We went to Kansas City to listen to independent pharmacists. We've really just traveled the entire country to make sure we are just getting out of the bit of the Beltway bubble and trying to make sure we're hearing directly from people about the economic challenges they face, and then also use those opportunities to tell them, here are the tools we have, here's what we're doing. And I think one thing that's really important here is one pathology that you can see sometimes in economic policy making is a lot of reliance on certain types of models and theories and assumptions that can become somewhat divorced and detached from economic reality, right? I mean, we saw that during the financial crisis, but I think we've seen that at various points since. And so, getting out there and hearing from regular people and making sure we're using that to inform our understanding of what's happening is also a good antidote. So again, making sure we just know what is the economic reality rather than just relying on some of these filters.
You've also utilized the Copyright Office to tackle the age-old problem with not only right to repair, which spans across many other key sectors, something that farmers have been advocating for consistently with like John Deere tractors and whatnot, but also with McDonald's franchisees that now have the right to repair their own ice cream machines due to your comment that you filed in support of this change. I feel like these are very meaningful. They're small but very meaningful ways in which you are working to change people's lives. Now, I guess the question I have is, it seems like we have a new administration coming in, the Trump administration. Now, there have been some interesting developments in terms of the way that Donald Trump at least responds to public pressure in a unique way that is unceremonious, unorthodox, in comparison to his other Republican counterparts. Are there things that Biden could do to, at least from what I understand, there is a thing that Biden can do right now to extend the amount of time you have as the head of this agency, given your a very popular track record so far and all of the meaningful ways that you have helped regular American citizens. Do you feel like there is an extension process that could possibly happen? I know this is a little bit of a difficult question to answer, but are you at liberty to discuss certain things or at least like speculate on it? Or is that too inappropriate to ask?
Look, I mean, the president always has the chance to nominate whoever they want, and if the Senate wants to take that up, they can do that. Time is short, and they're kind of focused on getting through set of people who've already been nominated. But I defer to the president and the Senate on what they choose to do there. I can't speculate about what's going to happen in the future, but we're just focused on using all of the time we have right now to get as much out of the door where we think if there are law violations, we want to bring lawsuits to make that clear. If there are rules that we think would address, persistent problems, be it on things like junk fees or privacy abuses for kids, we're focused on using the time we have to get those improvements. Yeah.
There are some unique supporters of yours within the Republican caucus as well, which is why I was wondering. You have, I believe, even Josh Hawley, who has stated, or other Republican politicians that have stated their support for some of the actions that you've taken. And I was wondering if there's any veracity to that. If there's any, you are popular in a bipartisan manner, it seems. Even though there were certainly some fissures, even with the way that I guess the Harris campaign was communicating, given some of their corporate benefactors. This is not what you're saying. This is what I'm saying. This is my assessment of the situation. So I guess you have a limited time frame that you can operate in, at least all things considered at this point. And you're using that time, that valuable time that you have to continue fighting the good fight. Is there? I guess the question is there any? Is there any? How do I ask this? Is there any honesty to the ways in which the Republicans have communicated that they like you, the Republican politicians? Have you had any conversations with Republican politicians that say that have given you assurances? In terms of maintaining your position as the commissioner of the FTC?
I'll just say generally, in this job, I've gotten the chance to interact and engage with and meet with senators and members of Congress from both parties. And taking on monopolies that are abusing their power is not a left issue. It's not a right issue. It's an American issue, right? And
Yeah.
when we went around the country, honestly, I would meet with people who would say things like, I've been a lifelong Republican, and let me tell you, your work to eliminate non-competes is the best thing government has done in my entire life. Right? I mean, the level of cross-partisan support that we have gotten for our work, I think, is truly off the charts. And you see that sometimes reflected in how members of Congress are engaging with the FTC. I hear from a lot of members that are very worried, especially those that represent rural districts in red states, about how Main Street is just getting decimated. And so you have independent groceries, independent pharmacies getting pushed out of business, not because their communities don't love them and depend on them and frequent them, but potentially because of illegal business practices somewhere else in the supply chain. We hear bipartisan concern about, private commercial surveillance and how that's affecting people's rights. I think on things like junk fees and subscription traps, I mean, taking those practices on is pretty unobjectionable. So I do think that we see a lot of, at a grassroots level, popular cross-partisan support for taking on illegal monopolies and illegal, actions by corporations. I think what you see going forward, we're just going to have to wait and see in terms of, what a future administration decides to do in terms of continuing some of this work or trying to reverse it.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. So one of the areas of interest for you has also been healthcare, and I was wondering if you have any initiatives lined up for that as well. If you want to speak on that. Seemingly, this is a point of concern for a lot of Americans that are, I guess, experiencing the many different awful aspects of for-profit healthcare in general, and the ways in which a lot of these healthcare providers have utilized the exact same vertical and horizontal integration to drive up costs and to offer inadequate care. And engage in some of these other illegal business practices.
Yeah, healthcare has been one of the top priorities during my time at the commission, just because, this is not discretionary purchase for people. Like, this is oftentimes life or death in some of people's scariest moments. So there are a few aspects of our work here. One is we've been taking on hospital mergers. There have been just decades of mergers between hospitals, and there's a lot of research showing that after hospitals merge, prices go up and quality of service goes down. It also can contribute to things like hospital deserts, especially in rural parts of the country.
Yeah.
We've also been focused on this issue of private equity coming into healthcare, where you have these, New York-based private equity firms that will come in and do these things called roll-ups, where they kind of buy series by series these whole set of smaller, say, anesthesiology practices or other firms that in the aggregate has rolled up and consolidated the whole market. So we brought a lawsuit last year against one of these private equity roll-ups that happened in the anesthesiology market, where this company came in, rolled up these anesthesiology providers, and then jacked up the prices. That was something that had been a bit more under the radar, and we've kind of shed more of a light on it. We're also looking just more generally at what are the drivers of higher drug prices for people, right? I mean, we know as a country, we spend more on healthcare and get worse outcomes, and people are paying more, especially for drugs that cost a fraction somewhere else. So I mentioned what we're doing in terms of scouring for patent abuse. And so what we did for inhalers, we've also now trying to do for EpiPens and things like Ozempic. We also have a lawsuit right now that's alleging that there were illegal business practices that led to inflated prices for insulin. So that's a litigation that's ongoing. But I think absolutely, I mean, interrogating whether corporate law breaking is driving up healthcare costs for Americans is absolutely something that needs to still be a priority for government.
It seems that in 1995 there were 60 leading pharmaceutical companies, but mergers since then have reduced that number to just 10, and it seems that mergers are continuing. Um, this is there a way that is there a way to directly communicate to the people that are listening, like how that ends up driving up costs, like to talk about it at the individual level? Because in the same way that you mentioned, in the same exact way that you mentioned how pharmaceutical corporations oftentimes engage in like patent cycling, which is very common. It's super common practice in general to disrupt the or to engage in like uh, uh, a patent ownership over an extended period of time. Is there some way to talk about that specifically with pharmaceutical mergers?
Yeah, happy to. And I'll give you a specific example in terms of a case we brought. So, we brought a case last year looking to block the merger of these two companies called Sanofi and Maze. And Sanofi at that time had a monopoly on the drug for something called Pompe disease, which is this really awful kind of muscle degeneration disease where people need medicines, and those medicines can be very expensive. And so Sanofi had a monopoly on that. Maze was this newer company that was in the process of developing a different treatment for Pompe disease. And this other treatment could, if it got to market, be a game changer because Sanofi's drug, you basically have to go get an IV biweekly. And Maze's drug, people could have just taken orally as a medicine, right? And so if you're somebody that has this disease, this new medicine could really improve your life dramatically. Sanofi was trying to buy up Maze. And we worried that because Sanofi is already making a lot of money through its existing drug, if they were allowed to go out and buy this upstart, they would not necessarily have the incentive to make sure that that new drug makes it onto market. Because if it did, it would start cannibalizing sales from their existing blockbuster monopoly drug. We brought a lawsuit that says Sanofi, you're buying Maze would violate the antitrust laws. They ended up walking away and Maze ended up partnering with some other company. But that's just a specific example of how, the basic philosophy underlying antitrust laws is that competition between businesses, it's what can contribute to the best outcome, right? Because if you have the monopoly company still having to look over its shoulder and say, hey, am I about to get lapped by this other guy? it's going to make them go faster, right? It's going to make them try to compete for people's businesses rather than just be confident that they've locked up the market and then they can become too big to care. They don't have to worry about, competing on price. They don't have to worry about innovating. And so that's just one example of how robust merger enforcement can make sure that Americans benefit from healthy competition on price, on innovation.
That's on the consumer side. Like, that's a consumer protective action. But I think it's also important to recognize the labor side of this equation as well. And I was wondering if you could at least speak a little bit. I know the decision just came down on the Kroger. Sorry, I always call it Kroger. $24.6 billion merger with Albertsons. Because when this conversation was taking place in a lot of mainstream media, the arguments that were presented was that these guys have labor unions. Some of them are actually like corporate unions in general, but regardless, they have like some semblance of labor unions, and that that this was actually this merger was necessary because it was life-saving. It was going to save this business at a time when they are having a difficult time competing with massive online retail stores such as Walmart and Amazon that are completely dominating the field. This decision being blocked, what kind of labor protections does that offer to people that are working at these corporations?
So, one thing that our lawsuit alleged was that if this merger goes through, it's going to mean higher grocery prices for shoppers, but it's also going to be worse for the workers. And this is the first time that the FTC has ever sought to block a merger, not just because it's going to be bad for consumers, but also because it's going to be bad for workers. And, especially in recent decades, antitrust enforcers had not really been focused on the worker harms as much. And that's something we've really looked to change. So the complaint lays out how previously, when there has been competition between Kroger and Albertsons, that the workers at each store were able to use that competition as leverage when they were trying to bargain. And that if you allow these two companies to merge, that leverage that comes from having a potential alternative employer or an alternative store where customers can go if there's a strike, but eliminating that leverage point and bargaining leverage would ultimately be bad for workers. So again, this is still being litigated, but that was in the complaint as an explanation for why this merger would be bad for workers. When the FTC team put on the trial, they actually had on the stand some of the workers that are currently employed by these stores so that they could also share their experience. And just generally, there's a lot of empirical evidence that now shows that after mergers, workers have seen, pay cuts or a limit in any pay rises. You often see layoffs. You can see workers have less negotiation power to figure out, will I even have a stable, predictable schedule? And so, these are all dimensions of competition on the labor front that are important to protect for people.
Lina Khan, thank you so much for coming on. I know you had limited time here. You're obviously very busy doing incredibly important work, both advocating for American workers and also advocating for American consumers. I hope to have you again on the broadcast soon. I know you have a busy day. Thank you so much for taking some time out to talk to us. It was wonderful to have you. Is there any last note that you want to end this conversation on?
No, just want to say thank you for having me on. And yeah, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was Lina Khan, the trust buster, the queen herself.